Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to another Jane Austen July video. Today I'm going to be talking about Sense and Sensibility and siblings. So in this video, I'm going to be talking both about siblings within the novel Sense and Sensibility, but also about the ways in which Jane Austen uses siblings and pairs of siblings and doubling to explore the themes of sense and sensibility and sense versus sensibility, which are so important in this novel. I hope that makes sense. This video is going to contain lots of spoilers for Sense and Sensibility, so if you haven't read Sense and Sensibility, please don't keep watching because I will spoil the entire plot for you, and it also won't make that much sense. I also wanted to say before I get fully into the video that a lot of my thoughts in this video are influenced by two great Jane Austen critics, John Mullen and Paula Byrne. I can't remember what thoughts have come from which. I feel like definitely a lot of my thoughts about the way siblings and doubling is used in Sense and Sensibility comes from Paula Byrne's amazing book, The Genius of Jane Austen, which is about how theatre influenced Jane Austen. But Paula Byrne's essay on Sense and Sensibility in that book talks a lot about siblings and doubling and how various other pairs of siblings, aside from the main pair of Elinor and Marianne, can tell us a lot about sense and sensibility. So I feel like she gets quite a lot of credit for quite a lot of my thoughts in this video, but hopefully this is still an interesting video to watch. I did also want to say that 4 years ago I made a video talking about siblings in the whole of Jane Austen, which was a shorter, quicker video, but might be interesting if you're interested in siblings in Jane Austen, so I'll link that down below too. And today let's talk in a bit more depth about siblings and Sense and Sensibility. Siblings are fascinating in Sense and Sensibility, and one of the things I love about this novel so much is the way that it looks at siblings. I have now read Sense and Sensibility I think 6 or 7 times, and it's a book that took me a long time to love. The first couple of times I read Sense and Sensibility, it was very much my least favourite Jane Austen novel. For a long time it was my least favourite Jane Austen novel, but these days it's really up there for me. I feel like Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park are still my favourites, but Sense and Sensibility would be right below them, and I think it is wonderful. And I feel like once I stopped reading Sense and Sensibility as a love story and started reading it as a sibling story, I got so much more out of it and I enjoyed it so much more. And it is a sibling story in so many ways. Obviously the book is very much about the relationship between Elinor and Marianne and their very different personalities, but there are also a lot of other siblings that feature within this book in really interesting ways, and quite a lot of them you can fit into kind of different aspects of sense and sensibility, so I thought that might be a kind of interesting thing to look at today. So let's start off with talking about Elinor and Marianne, because of course they are very important in this novel and they are really the sense and sensibility in the title. Elinor represents sense. She is very intelligent and very prudent and careful, and she is very practical in many ways, whereas her sister Marianne is much more emotional. She has great sensibility, she wears her heart on her sleeve, she's much more passionate, or at least she's much more passionate outwardly. Elinor also has very deep emotions, but she knows how to govern them and control them in a way that Marianne does not. In many ways, the title of Sense and Sensibility should have alerted me much sooner in my reading of this book to the fact that it is more of a sibling story than it is a love story, though there are love story elements in it too. But I find it really interesting to look at Elinor and Marianne and their relationship in light of sense versus sensibility, especially as, although Elinor is there to represent sense and Marianne to represent sensibility, it's actually a bit more complicated than that, and they both do have elements of each. I'm going to read the introduction of Elinor and Marianne from chapter 1 because I think this is quite interesting. Elinor possessed a strength of understanding and coolness of judgment which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counsellor of her mother. She had an excellent heart, her disposition was affectionate and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was a knowledge which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. Marianne's abilities were, in many respects, quite equal to Elinor's. She was sensible and clever, and eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys, could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. The resemblance between her and her mother was strikingly great. Margaret, the other sister, was a good-humoured, well-disposed girl, but as she had already imbibed a good deal of Marianne's romance, without having much of her sense, she did not, at 13, bid fair to equal her sisters at a more advanced period of her life. I think this is a really interesting introduction to these characters for lots of reasons, because we see that Elinor is the sense of the title, but also she does have very strong emotions. She just knows how to keep them hidden. And we know that Marianne has sense. We're explicitly told that she has a lot more sense than Margaret is ever going to have, poor Margaret. But she also has these really strong emotions that she takes no pains to hide. I really love how the novel looks at the differences between the sisters. And one thing I also find quite interesting about Sense and Sensibility is how it kind of plays with the form of the sentimental novel. I think we all kind of know that Northanger Abbey is a pastiche of the Gothic novel, because Gothic tropes are kind of still very evident, and we kind of all know what they mean because Gothic literature went on a lot longer. But Sense and Sensibility is also really in conversation with the sentimental novel, an 18th and early 19th century form of literature that kind of focused on and really sort of put on a pedestal these big, grand, romantic emotions. Marianne fits much more neatly as a heroine of a sentimental novel than Elinor would, and I think in some ways Jane Austen in Sense and Sensibility is pointing out that actually the heroines of sentimental novels are not necessarily very wise, and sometimes it would be better to be a bit more like Elinor. As we see in Sense and Sensibility, Marianne puts her passion for Willoughby on display and indulges in her grief over Willoughby when he abandons her. And not only does she make her affections very, very widely known, but also she endangers her life. She makes herself ill by not looking after herself after Willoughby ends the connection between them. Within this novel, Austen kind of shows us that Marianne needs to learn from her sister Elinor to have more sense and less sensibility, to not indulge in grief in the same way and to regulate her own emotions. Later, when her and Elinor are looking back on what has happened with Willoughby, Marianne says how she regrets her own conduct, and Elinor says, "Do you compare your conduct with his?" Marianne replies, "No, I compare it with what it ought to have been. I compare it with yours." Soon after, she says, "Long before I was enough recovered to talk, I was perfectly able to reflect. I considered the past. I saw in my own behaviour since the beginning of our acquaintance with him last autumn nothing but a series of imprudence towards myself and want of kindness to others. I saw that my own feelings had prepared my sufferings, and that my want of fortitude under them had almost led me to the grave. My illness, I well knew, had been entirely brought on by myself by such negligence of my own health as I had felt even at the time to be wrong. Had I died, it would have been self-destruction." And in some ways, I think it's easy to read this novel as Marianne learning to put aside sensibility and focus on sense. But actually, things are not quite as simple as that. We see that Marianne does not throw away her romantic, emotional nature. Yes, she marries Colonel Brandon less out of a passionate attachment and more out of friendship and affection, but we are told that Marianne could never love by halves, and her whole heart became in time as much devoted to her husband as it had once been to Willoughby. She gets that passion back for Colonel Brandon, it just takes her time. And while Marianne learns her lesson and learns that her excess of emotion has been too much, Elinor also opens herself up to hurt by her lack of visible emotion. She hides her feelings for Edward as best she can in order to protect herself. She thinks that is a sensible thing to do, but in some ways her endeavour to hide her love for him opens her up to more harm because it allows Edward to tell himself that he isn't hurting her. We have a moment later where Edward and Elinor are kind of discussing what initially went on between them, and he says that he told himself that the danger is on my own. I'm doing no injury to anybody but myself, when he was kind of getting to know Elinor and falling in love with her. He told himself that he was not hurting her, and I think one of the reasons why he was able to do that was because Elinor is not passionate in the way Marianne is and didn't display her affection that openly. And think about the moment when Marianne accuses Elinor of not really being in love with Edward. Elinor has told Marianne about Edward's engagement to Lucy, and she's tried to do so in a calm way. And Marianne says, "If such is your way of thinking, if the loss of what is most valued is so easily to be made up by something else, your resolution, your self-command are perhaps a little less to be wondered at. They are brought more within my comprehension." And Elinor replies, "I understand you. You do not suppose that I have ever felt much." Elinor's cool, rational ways and her determination to control her emotions have led Marianne to misunderstand her and to therefore say something that really wounds Elinor. And Elinor goes on to explain just how unhappy she has been, but how much she has had to control herself in order not to show it. And later we see that their mother has also been kind of neglecting Elinor because she hasn't understood how strong Elinor's feelings are, and because Marianne's feelings are always so so much more visibly on display, she has kind of ended up looking after Marianne more than Elinor. She found that she had been misled by the careful, the considerate attention of her daughter to think the attachment, which once she had so well understood, much slighter in reality than she had been wont to believe, or than it was now proved to be. She feared that under this persuasion she had been unjust, inattentive, nay, almost unkind to her Elinor, that Marianne's affliction, because more acknowledged, more immediately before her, had too much engrossed her tenderness, and led her away to forget that in Elinor she might have a daughter suffering almost as much, certainly with less self-provocation and greater fortitude. So in this way we can see that both Elinor and Marianne open themselves up to harm by being too little or too much, one or the other. And I think what Austen is kind of arguing in Sense and Sensibility is that there's got to be a better middle ground, probably more towards the sense, I think. I think she thinks in general that Elinor has kind of behaved better and has a better side of it than Marianne, but actually Elinor also hurts herself by being too far towards sense and rationality, though to not as great a degree as Marianne hurts herself by being too emotional. And they could both learn quite a bit from each other. But what I find really interesting in Sense and Sensibility is that there are quite a lot of other sibling pairs, or more than pairs, that we see in this novel, who we can also kind of put interestingly into the sort of sense or sensibility categories. So let's turn first to the other siblings of Marianne and Elinor, because they also have a younger sister, Margaret, and an older half-brother, John. And Margaret is definitely all sensibility, more so than Marianne. I read already the bit from chapter 1 where we're told that Margaret was a good-humoured, well-disposed girl who has a good deal of Marianne's romance without having much of her sense. We don't see that much of Margaret throughout the novel, but what we're told about her, she would definitely fall into the sensibility category. Whereas the elder half-brother John is definitely more on the sense side of the question. In fact, John kind of prioritises sense to the extent that he kind of is a bit heartless. That's a little bit reductive, and sense is perhaps not exactly the right word, but he's certainly not an emotional man, not a man who thinks very highly of emotions. All his emotions are quite sort of shallow, I suppose, and he's not someone who has any passion like a character like Marianne, or indeed like Elinor, though her passion is much further underneath the surface. We're told that John is not an ill-disposed young man, unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish is to be indisposed, but he was, in general, well respected, for he conducted himself with propriety in the discharge of his ordinary duties. Had he married a more amiable woman, he might have been made more respectable than he was. He might have even been made amiable himself, for he was very young when he married and was very fond of his wife. But Mrs. John Dashwood was a strong caricature of himself, more narrow-minded and selfish. He is not a good brother at all to his sisters, and his lack of emotion makes him not an evil, wicked person, but definitely not a good one either. We see him throughout the novel just kind of being careless and selfish and self-involved, and looking for ways to make himself feel better about the fact that he is really inattentive to his sisters. And he always places prudence, which we're told is a quality Elinor has a lot of and Marianne doesn't have a lot of. John always places prudence above kindness, especially with regards to his own money. Another interesting pair of siblings we see in this novel is Lady Middleton and Charlotte Palmer, who are Mrs. Jennings' two daughters. And these two are really interesting because I think in a way we can map them quite neatly onto Elinor and Marianne and Sense and Sensibility. Lady Middleton is definitely on the sense side, although a bit like John Dashwood, she takes the rational or sense position to the point of coldness. She is distant and polite and doesn't care for much about anything except her children. Like Elinor, she gives few outward displays of emotions, although unlike Elinor, we're kind of uncertain to what degree she has that many emotions. She has the polite civility of Elinor without Elinor's deep feelings. We're told the first time we meet her that her manners had all the elegance which her husband's wanted, but they would have been improved by some share of his frankness and warmth, and her visit was long enough to detract something from their first admiration by showing that, though perfectly well bred, she was reserved, cold, and had nothing to say for herself beyond the most commonplace inquiry or remark. And contrast this with her exceptionally different sister Charlotte Palmer, who is talkative and over the top and much more on the sensibility end, although how much her sensibility is genuine and how much kind of put on is hard to tell. She has the emotional excess of Marianne without the genuine warmth behind it. We're told when we first meet her that Mrs. Mrs. Palmer was several years younger than Lady Middleton and totally unlike her in every respect. Her manners were by no means so elegant as her sister's, but they were much more prepossessing. She came in with a smile, smiled all the time of her visit, except when she laughed, and smiled when she went away. Mrs. Palmer, who was strongly endowed by nature with a turn for being uniformly civil and happy, was hardly seated before her admiration of the parlour and everything in it burst forth. The way Mrs. Palmer sort of excessively praises Barton Cottage and also Elinor's drawings reminds me of the moment where Marianne goes into raptures about the autumn leaves at Norland, except that Mrs. Palmer's sentiments are not quite so strongly felt as Marianne's, and they pass quickly. Well, what a delightful room this is. I never saw anything so charming. Only think, Mamma, how it has improved since I was last here. I always thought it's such a sweet place, Ma'am, but you have made it so charming. Only look, sister, how delightful everything is. How I should like such a house for myself. Mrs. Palmer's eye was now caught by the drawings which hung around the room. She got up to examine them. Oh dear, how beautiful they are. Well, how delightful. Do but look, Mamma, how sweet. I declare they are quite charming. I could look at them forever. And then sitting down again, she very soon forgot that there were ever such things in the room. So we can see that while she may have kind of Marianne's enthusiasm for lots of things, she doesn't really have the real strength of feeling behind them. She is someone who is sort of putting on the performance of being like Marianne without necessarily actually being like her. I think it's quite interesting to see as well that out of these two sisters, they have married men who don't seem to suit them very well, but might possibly suit their sisters better. In a way, it feels like they might be better suited the other way round. Although maybe if Lady Middleton had married Mr. Palmer, they would just spend like forever in cold silence, which I find quite an entertaining thought, but there we go. Another important pair of sisters in this novel is of course Lucy and Anne Steele. Again here we have sense in Lucy and a lack of it in Anne, but Lucy takes sense and prudence and practicality to the point of cunning and scheming, and Anne takes sensibility to the point of silliness. We know that Marianne is very romantic, but where Marianne's romantic tendencies lead her early on in the novel to think that she could never possibly find a man who would ever please her, whereas Anne Steele's romantic tendencies lead her to talk about nothing but beau and later her own particular beau, the Doctor. Lucy, by contrast, is all practicality and again prudence like Elinor has, but also falseness. And this is really interesting to think about, I think, in comparison to Elinor, because Elinor is also a bit false in places. She often conceals her emotions in a way Marianne doesn't, and she often kind of pretends to like people that we know she doesn't like. Actually, the whole of Lucy and Elinor's friendship is characterised by both of them pretending that they're friends. Like Lucy is pretending that they're friends, but Elinor is kind of also pretending it too, because it's the only way she can possibly go along with it. There's a moment in the novel where Marianne says to Elinor, "Our situations then are alike. We neither of us have anything to tell, you because you do not communicate, and I because I conceal nothing." And it's true that Elinor does not communicate, and that in that way she is often kind of being false or lying by omission. And Lucy's falseness and cunning is sort of a more extreme version of that falseness that we see in Elinor, that is there as self-protection and as civility, but to Lucy it becomes something more. Lucy is described as cunning, and we know that she is very practical. She wants to marry, and to marry as well as possible, and she has very little sort of emotional depth. She purposefully confides in Elinor because she views Elinor as a rival for Edward's hand in marriage, but then she switches sides later and sort of flatters Robert Ferrars into marrying her once he has got all the money that she was hoping Edward would have. And it's really interesting, I think, to think about Lucy and Anne as like really extreme versions of Elinor and Marianne, because I think that shows us that although Elinor is sense and Marianne is sensibility, actually there are a lot of different ways that those two themes and those two kind of characteristics could be taken. And there are other characters in the book who kind of take those things in different directions or display them to greater extremes. And then, of course, within Sense and Sensibility, we also have the Ferrars siblings, a very interesting trio, Robert and Edward and Fanny, who are all very different in very different ways. Edward, I think, like Elinor, is mostly sense when it comes to sensibility, although I think he has less sense than Elinor and less prudence. Certainly it was not very prudent of him to get engaged to Lucy as he did several years ago, but at the same time, knowing what we know about Lucy and what a kind of more determined person she is, it's easy to see how that would have happened. I actually really like Edward Ferrars. I feel like he's a character who a lot of people don't like, but I think he's really underrated, and I actually really like him. And the more I read Sense and Sensibility and the more I look out for the appearances of him we get, because he's not in it necessarily that much, but I actually really feel for his shyness and his indecision. I should do a video just about Edward Ferrars sometime, maybe another year. I feel like I can really see how someone who is that painfully shy could form an attachment to someone like Lucy, who is in every way the more forceful character of the two, and how he would then really kind of suffer with indecisiveness about breaking it off, but also in the early 19th century system, to break off an engagement with a woman is basically to retract her like future life and income. To break off an engagement at this point of time is like both breaking up with someone and firing them at the same time. At this point in time, women could sue men for breach of promise if they had offered them marriage and then gone back on that promise. They could literally sue them for compensation for damages, for money, because they have been promised a husband and, you know, financial support and an income that they were no longer going to have. So I think within the context of the Regency period, it's much easier to understand why Edward does not break off the engagement to a woman he doesn't love at a time when marriage is not just about love. There's a lot more going on here. And he also is kind of too nice to really understand Lucy's character, which I quite like him for. Every time Edward Ferrars is present in a scene and doesn't know what to say and just like mutters something under his breath and hopes someone assumed that he said the right thing, I just really feel for him. But there we go, that's just me. Anyway, tangent aside about my affection for Edward Ferrars, I wanted to read a little bit from earlier on in the book, one of the first things we're told about him. Edward Ferrars was not recommended to their good opinion by any peculiar graces of person or address. He was not handsome, and his manners acquired intimacy to make them pleasing. He was too diffident to do justice to himself, but when his natural shyness was overcome, his behaviour gave every indication of an open, affectionate heart. His understanding was good, and his education had given it solid improvements. Edward does have strong emotions, he has a strong sense of honour towards Lucy, and he is also very much in love with Elinor, as his kind of like immediately rushing to Barton after the end of his engagement demonstrates. But he definitely doesn't have the sort of sensibility of characters like Marianne. He's too sort of calm and introverted for that. And he doesn't have the romantic taste that Marianne prizes in people. In fact, one of the very early things we kind of hear about Edward is Marianne criticising Edward for not having strong enough emotional sensibilities and romantic sensibilities. Edward is very amiable and I love him tenderly, but yet he is not the kind of young man. There is something wanting. His figure is not striking. It has none of that grace which I could expect in a man who could seriously attach my sister. His eyes want all that spirit, that fire, which at once announce virtue and intelligence. And beside all this, I am afraid, mamma, he has no real taste. Music seems scarcely to attract him, and though he admires Elinor's drawing very much, it is not the admiration of a person who can understand their worth. It is evident, in spite of his frequent attention to her while she draws, that in fact he knows nothing of the matter. He admires as a lover, not as a connoisseur. To satisfy me, those characters must be united. I could not be happy with a man whose taste did not in every point coincide with my own. He must enter into all my feelings. The same books, the same music must charm us both. Oh, mamma, how spiritless, how tame was Edward's manner in reading to us last night. I felt for my sister most severely, yet she bore it with so much composure. She seemed scarcely to notice it. I could hardly keep my seat. To hear those beautiful lines which have frequently almost driven me wild, pronounced with such impenetrable calmness, such dreadful indifference. Poor Edward being criticised by Marianne because he can't read well aloud. This is why I like Edward. I just feel quite sorry for him. Not everyone has your talents, Marianne. But we can see that Edward, like Elinor, has strong emotions, but often keeps them under the surface, and definitely doesn't have the kind of romantic sensibility and passion and fire that Marianne herself has and that Marianne looks for in other people. Moving on to a different Ferrars sibling, I think Robert probably fits the most into sort of sensibility, although his sensibilities are basically very shallow. He definitely doesn't have any sense, but it also seems unlikely that his feelings are especially deep in the way that, say, Marianne's are. The first time we see him, he's spending a very, very long time being picky about a toothpick case he's buying, which is like a tiny thing. It's really important that it's a toothpick case, something that is tiny and also like slightly gross. So he's spending all this time and effort like making this really beautiful thing in which to store things to pick his teeth with. Like, I think it's really important that he's that like vain even about a toothpick case. He comes across as completely foppish and ridiculous, and also very sort of selfish because there's lots of other people waiting and he's just taking up all the shopkeeper's time. And then later on, the fact that he is basically flattered into marrying Lucy shows us again his vanity and his sort of selfishness. It's not a match that has much sense in it. Yes, Robert now has money settled on him and he's not going to be impoverished, but with all the fashion we know he has, he could probably have married someone quite a lot wealthier. He doesn't know Lucy very well. His family are definitely going to not approve. He's going to alienate both his mother and his sister, who are really going to disapprove of him marrying this penniless girl, but he's also going to completely alienate his brother, who was literally just engaged to her. Like, it's a really terrible idea that he marries Lucy, but we sort of get the sense that he does it because she just flattered him, and because he has so long considered himself his brother Edward's superior, that he kind of likes the idea of marrying someone that was originally going to marry his brother. That is, I think, the easiest way to explain Robert's decision there. We're told that Edward could only attempt an explanation by supposing that perhaps at first accidentally meeting, the vanity of one had been so worked on by the flattery of the other as to lead by degrees to all the rest. And with such shallow feelings as he has, it's kind of hard to fit Robert into either sense or sensibility, but I think it is really interesting to compare Robert and Edward Ferrars and see how Austen really draws the characters of both by comparing and contrasting them to each other, just as she does with Elinor and Marianne, just as she does with Lady Middleton and Mrs. Palmer, just as she does with Anne and Lucy Steele. She has all these siblings, and by pitting them against each other and showing their very different characteristics, she's able to tell you so much more about each person. We also, of course, have the third Ferrars sibling, once Miss Ferrars, now Fanny Dashwood. She, I think, is mostly sense more than sensibility, and like her husband, she is calculating and selfish and kind of takes that sense and prudence to the extreme, caring only for money and what it can do for herself, her husband, and her son. There is, of course, the moment where she goes into hysterics on learning about Lucy and Edward's engagement, which perhaps does suggest some deeper emotions, but it's also kind of difficult to know how much that excessive emotion is sort of put on and pretended as a sort of like public demonstration of her shock, which is definitely how I've always read it from what we know about Fanny Dashwood in the rest of the novel. Obviously, it is a bit reductive to try and fit all of these different characters and all of these different pairs of siblings sort of into the division between sense and sensibility. Things are not quite so simple as that, and that is the point. And Jane Austen always writes really wonderfully rich, complex characters. But I do think it's quite interesting to look at how sense and sensibility kind of manifest in different characters, especially in different individuals within groups of siblings within this novel, because I do think that can tell you quite a lot about the characters and also how Jane Austen is exploring her themes. I also think it's quite interesting to look at the relationships between all the siblings in light of sense versus sensibility. Considering how different Elinor and Marianne are, they're really close and they're really good friends, whereas we don't get much of an impression of closeness between Lady Middleton and Mrs. Palmer, really. Lucy is always telling Anne off, and Robert and Edward Ferrars obviously don't have much in common or get on well at all. Robert obviously has a very little regard for Edward, if we're to judge by his behaviour later on in the novel. So I think that's quite interesting, and maybe in a way it's because Elinor and Marianne, although one is sense and one is sensibility, they do have kind of both aspects within them, both elements within them, and both of them have very deep feelings internally. They just manifest those or don't in very, very different ways. Another thing I did want to touch upon in this video is the relationships between sort of future siblings-in-law, because this is something I really like in Sense and Sensibility, and another element that I really value in this book that I kind of noticed more as I reread the book. The friendship between people who later become siblings-in-law are really nice in this book. So Colonel Brandon and Elinor have this great friendship that I really enjoy. I do know that quite a lot of readers kind of feel like Elinor and Colonel Brandon might feel like a more natural marriage, like a more sensible pairing. They might fit together better, but I would disagree with that. And I really enjoy their friendship. I think Elinor and Colonel Brandon have a strong friendship founded in their shared love, their very different love, obviously, for Marianne, and also a real kind of sympathy with each other and a real understanding of each other as people. And I love that Colonel Brandon is friends with Elinor because it shows his real true, genuine regard for Marianne and his care for her well-being. And you get a sense that his love for Marianne is much less selfish and self-involved than Willoughby's affection for Marianne is. On a side note about Colonel Brandon, I think he's quite an interesting one to think about in terms of the sense versus sensibility divide, because he is quite quiet and reserved, and on the surface reads more like Elinor. The first thing we're told about him is that he is silent and grave. However, he also has very, very deep feelings, and he sort of remains true to his first love, Eliza, for a very, very long time. And the time that we see him kind of be the most open, where he tells Elinor the story of his life and his love for Eliza and what happened to her, he really struggles to control his emotions, and we see that maybe once when he was younger he was a lot more like Marianne, and sadness has kind of softened and tempered his sensibility in the same way that it does kind of to Marianne over the course of this book. We get the sense throughout the novel that he has a great deal of emotional intelligence. We're told that he is on every occasion mindful of the feelings of others, and in many ways he has a lot of sensibility, even if it is a little bit more under the surface. On one of the first occasions where we meet Colonel Brandon, we see him listening to Marianne's music, and this is what we're told. Colonel Brandon alone of all the party heard her without being in raptures. He paid her only the compliment of attention, and she felt a respect for him on the occasion which the others had reasonably forfeited by their shameless want of taste. His pleasure in music, though it amounted not to that ecstatic delight which alone could sympathise with her own, was estimable when contrasted with the horrible insensibility of the others, and she was reasonable enough to allow that a man of 35 might well have outlived all acuteness of feeling and every exquisite power of enjoyment. Marianne performs her music for the company, and everyone says that they love it, but she kind of knows that they're not really meaning it because they weren't really paying attention and listening, whereas Colonel Brandon doesn't say that, but he was clearly paying a lot of attention and he was clearly listening. He doesn't have the insensibility of the other people present, and I think that's really interesting. Returning to the sibling-in-law friendships, I really enjoy the friendship between Edward and Marianne. As I have already said in this video, I really like Edward Ferrars a lot, and we know that he is very shy and reserved, and his relationship with Elinor is obviously always kind of under strain because he loves her and maybe thinks that she might return that affection, but he also occupies a false position towards her. He's very aware of that. On his visit to Barton, we see that he is, depressed and really sort of struggling with the turmoil of his own emotions and with the future that he thinks awaits him, separated from Elinor forever as he must be, and going to marry a woman who he doesn't love and can't even really respect. But he is comfortable with Marianne, as though Marianne were his own sister, as indeed she is going to become in law later on in the novel. And there's a few really nice moments where we see Edward tease Marianne, which I really like, because you get to see a sort of lighter, happier side of him and the person that he could be more without this weight on his mind. He teases Marianne about her love of the picturesque, and we have this lovely moment where after she has been saying what she considers a reasonable income in order to maintain a family, a proper establishment of servants, a carriage, perhaps two, and hunters, Willoughby comes up later in the discussion and Edward begins to see what's going on. Edward saw enough to comprehend not only the meaning of others, but such of Marianne's expressions as had puzzled him before, and when the visitors left them, he went immediately round her and said in a whisper, "I have been guessing. Shall I tell you my guess?" "What do you mean? Shall I tell you?" "Certainly." "Well then, I guess that Mr. Willoughby hunts." Marianne was surprised and confused, yet she could not help smiling at the quiet archness of his manner. And I really like the dynamic between Edward and Marianne, this really nice, affectionate friendship. I really like later on in the novel when they're in London and Marianne has been let down by Willoughby and is in kind of deep depression, and Edward comes to see them and she's so happy to see him, not only because she views this as a happiness for her sister, but also because she just really likes him and they're just good friends and there is a real affection between them. And it's really nice in Sense and Sensibility to see the friendships between the sort of future siblings-in-law, because within 19th century literature, you don't get to see platonic friendships between men and women that often. And so I really enjoy the portraits of those relationships in Sense and Sensibility as a novel. Another kind of interesting thing in Sense and Sensibility is that we see a lot of Marianne's relationship with Willoughby through the eyes of Elinor, and we actually see quite a bit of Elinor's relationship with Edward through the eyes of Marianne. We're often seeing each one of their love stories through the eyes of their sister, who is observing them and not quite able to understand understand how they're going about their love story. Marianne can't really understand Elinor's sort of coolness about Edward, and Elinor can't understand Marianne's sort of ardour and strong expression of emotion when it comes to Willoughby. We start off the novel hearing about Edward and Elinor's potential relationships through Marianne's dialogue with her mother and Marianne's thoughts about it, and later on in the novel when Marianne meets Willoughby, we see most of their relationship from Elinor's perspective. And I think that's one of the things that the first time I read Sense and Sensibility, it kind of bothered me because I wanted to be in the heads of these people experiencing these love stories. But actually it's something that on reflection and on rereads I think is really clever, because it is, as I said, a sibling story, and we're getting these sisters looking at each other's love stories and not quite understanding how their sister is behaving. And I think that's something that is really interesting, and that really adds a lot of value and difference to the book, I guess. So I feel like that is everything I wanted to say about siblings and Sense and Sensibility in Sense and Sensibility. I love this novel a lot, and I hope you have been enjoying reading it for the group read this Jane Austen July if you've been partaking. I think it's such an interesting novel, and I think the way siblings are looked at in this book is really interesting, and also the way Jane Austen kind of uses siblings and doubling to look at sense and sensibility as two things that may, you know, exist in abundance in one person or another, or that may exist jointly in people. Like, I think it's just really interesting and really well done. I don't think I have many conclusions to draw in this video, but I hope this has been an interesting listen and watch. And if you're someone who, like I used to be, has struggled with Sense and Sensibility as a novel, then hopefully this might add a few new elements to think about. Do let me know down in the comments your thoughts. What do you think of Sense and Sensibility and the sibling relationships and comparisons within it? That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.